All right, guys. It's Mr. Draper coming at you here. So I wanted to walk you through this. I'm going to do the best without, hopefully, because my head is completely stuffed up and everything else. But I wanted you guys to be able to go through this with me since I do have to be out for Friday, awaiting the PCR COVID test here. So make sure that you guys have your lecture notes for lecture number 4. We already started the one slide here the other day. Okay, so you guys should have that there. And then we also talked about before we watched, let me see here. There. From the so we just finished watching this on Thursday today. So what we were going to plan on doing if I was in class was moving on to the next slides. To sort of wrap up this unit. Also, you'll notice that hopefully it was relayed to you that I'm going to push the chapter 4 reading guide to tomorrow. So don't worry about that. Hopefully you had a chance to finish that up today. And hopefully I don't have COVID, and hopefully I'll be back on Monday. At least that's the hope, because don't feel so good right now. But let's work through this, okay? So what I'd like you to do this way, since it's screencastified, you can literally stop this at any time. If you need to, for having to stop so you can take some notes, perfect, not a problem. So basically what we're talking about here, which is what we've been focusing on, which is at what point does the British colonies feel it's a breaking point, right? And how much is England going to push in order for the colonies to basically assess that and feel like it's time to move, right? It's time to make a move. Is it time for independence? Is it time for war? All that kind of good stuff. So, as we talked about on, forget my days right now, as we talked on Wednesday, we know that war costs money, right? So, this French and Indian War, which basically ends salutary neglect, right? It ends salutary neglect. The redcoats were not pulled away after the French and Indian War, which the American colonists thought would happen, and they wanted to have happen because thank you for showing up and taking care of business. You guys can leave now. So we have a new prime minister, we have a new king, and both felt, you know what, we've left these colonies alone long enough. And then also they were assessing how many taxes were British folks back in England paying as compared to British colonies, right? And what they found is that essentially the folks back in England are paying 3 times the amount of taxes that the colonies are. So it made pretty good sense that since we came over to help fight this war for you, that you should then bear the brunt of having to pay for it. Okay. Well, obviously that didn't go over well with the colonists, but remember, keep that in your mindset, which is, they've been left alone for 60 years. And then all of a sudden now they're being held to an accountability piece with the taxes. So obviously that's not going to go over well. So let's take a look at the different taxes, okay? And then also pay attention to the reactions, right? So sugar would be one of them, right? And that's the first one, 1764. And what this is going to do is essentially, because we were bringing in not only sugar, but also molasses up to New England region, which is great for making rum. And then you take the rum and the triangular trade, as you remember, you go over and exchange that for African slaves. So we're both bringing in sugar, molasses, wine, etc. from the Caribbean region down there in the West Indies. Now, why would they do this? Well, the big thing is we were also, during salutary neglect, we were smuggling and selling things on the black market, buying things on the black market from other countries, particularly the Dutch. And then England found out that that was going on. So to hopefully kind of curb those imports illegally, what they wanted to do is essentially raise the import tax on that. And so essentially it would have to make the biggest impact, not necessarily on the folks buying sugar for their tea, but more so the rum distillers up in the New England area. Okay, so you're going to see some real continuity, and that's a big remember, that's a big skill and tool that we use, is to assess essentially continuity, right? So continuity, the tax is passed. how do the colonists react? Okay, so do they kind of repeat the same behaviors, right? So what are the reactions? Protests in the streets, particularly up in New England, because that's going to be the biggest impacted area. And how England responds to that is by lowering the tax on sugar, right? So essentially, they started off saying, "Hey, we know you're smuggling. We know you're bringing in this illegal sugar, wine, molasses, and so we know you're doing that. And so now any sugar, molasses, wine has to be bought directly from England, so it's directly brought in." And we're going to charge a high import tax on it to make sure that you guys don't do that anymore. So, protests in the streets, making signs. Nobody's killing anybody, but we're protesting. And then what that leads to is the king and parliament lowering the duty, the tax to be paid. So, if you're a colonist, you probably are thinking, hey, all I have to do is take to the streets, protest, scream loudly, and England will take the tax away. Okay, now that wasn't the real truth, but at least that's what they're perceiving. The second is because the redcoats have not left and they are being housed there. England passed which by the way was illegal back in England, but now we're bringing it legal here in America. And if you think about it, these people are still British colonists, right? So technically, this should also apply to them, but it's not, which is also one of the reasons why they're going to scream at the fact that you've denied us and are infringing on our rights. So what the Quartering Act is that if a group of redcoats need food, need housing, they could technically knock on your door, and you would have to house them, feed them, and you're home. And you might have children. You don't trust these guys. They're super arrogant. They're not nice. So that's not going to go over well as well. Stamp Act, probably the one that has the most, I'd say, impact. Okay. So when we think of stamps, we think of something that, you put on a letter and then mail it, right? So back then, stamps were essentially this special embossed paper that basically any legal document, divorce paper, land title, heck, they even made newspaper companies buy this paper. They made, if you're going to do playing cards, they made you buy the paper from these stamp offices. And so essentially anything that was a legal document plus newspapers plus playing card companies, you actually had to go down to the stamp office and actually buy special paper in order to print it on. Okay. And it's, to the colonists, this was like, hey, it's paper. We've always done this. Why are you having me spend this extra money? So England responded with saying that this pay, or the money that's collected, is going to pay for the redcoats, kind of like their salaries to stay in America. The colonial version of that is, well, we don't want them to stay here, right? So why don't you just have them go home? Well, salutary neglect is over. And so England's not going to kind of bow down on that one, okay? So what this is going to lead to when you talk about protest is this is the one that's really going to kick up. Okay, you've got essentially Sam Adams up in the Boston, Massachusetts area. He is essentially now started a more of a revolutionary type rebellious group known as the Sons of Liberty. We also have the women on that side of that were known as the Daughters of Liberty. And so they're starting to, at least the men on the Sons piece are starting to, really kind of violently react to the Stamp Act or the Stamp Office collectors. So they're getting attacked on their way home from work by the Sons of Liberty. They're getting tarred and feathered, which is an extremely painful process. There's a video clip here after this particular slide you should watch from the show Adams here that I posted, which kind of shows you that. Daughters of Liberty, how are they rebelling? What they're doing is they're doing more knitting circles to make clothes that locals could buy, as opposed to being forced to buy the manufactured cloth that's coming out of England. This is also the first time that we see colonies since the Albany Congress have met together to discuss how to react to this Stamp Act. And that's referred to the Stamp Act Congress meaning, a meeting of representatives. So now we've got 9 colonies meeting in New York, okay? And essentially what's going to happen is they're going to actually write a petition, which was referred to as the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, to the King, King George III, to basically implore him, here's the rights you're violating, here's our grievances, which is our complaints, and here's what we would like to see done, and essentially to repeal these taxes, right? So as you can see, this is what some of the paper looked like back then, and it did cost different money based on what you were buying the paper for. Okay, you can see the colonial reactions here. This one up in case of Boston, where you're seeing people, burning the king's body in effigy, which is essentially like a scarecrow, and they had King George on it, and they set fire to it in reaction. And then the Stamp Act, here's your stamp, right? Skull and crossbones. So obviously this is kicking up a notch, right? Sons of Liberty, tar and feathering these stamp collectors. Not necessarily the best approach, because that's going to only be met with more violence, right? Backlash from the redcoats. This is, oh, okay, well, you'll have to watch that on your device there, with your separate email. But anywho, I'll see if I can put another link in there that it works for. And this is the listing of the Quartering Act, which again, they should be allowed to stay in your homes, use supplies for whatever you need, let them stay as long as they need, provide them with food. And by the way, this is all at your cost, okay? Which is definitely an infringement on your personal rights and property. And then we see the Daughters of Liberty and their knitting circles right there. So tensions are going to heat up, right? This is the second phase of the crisis here. Tensions are going to heat up for sure. So essentially, what happened with the Stamp Act? Well, it was repealed as well, right after the Declaration of Rights and Grievances was listed. So we have the Sugar Act repealed. We see the Stamp Act repealed. So if you're a colonist, you're thinking to yourself, this is awesome. All I have to do is make a bunch of noise, burn some things in effigy, make signs, take to the streets, yell with thousands of other people, down with the taxes. And then all of a sudden, England hears this and goes, oh no, we're scared of American colonists. Let's take those things away. Truth be told, that had absolutely nothing to do with it. Truth be told, and I'll show you in the bar graph here in a second, it had more to do with the amount, or I should say the minimal amounts of profits that were coming in from the taxes, because the colonists essentially boycotted. They refused to go buy the paper. They refused to buy the sugar and the molasses, things like that. So it cost more money for England to manage collecting the taxes than actually was making taxes in tax money. So we've seen two of the taxes repealed. The colonists think it's because of them. England's thinking it's just more of a money management piece. So then what they passed, which was referred to as the Declaratory Act, and if you look at the root of the word right there, to declare. And so what England is declaring is, from here on out, Parliament and the King has a right to have complete control over your colonies and enforce by force, if need be, the collection of taxes. We also see a brand new Secretary of Finance coming in by the name of Charles Townshend. And the big thought was, well, if the Stamp Act's not working to collect, if the Sugar Act's not working to collect, and we've repealed both, what could we possibly pass for taxes on the colonies that we know for sure they can't make in America? So they decided to raise the tax on glass, the making of glass, lead, paint, and then also tea. Now, what they didn't realize is that over 60 years here, essentially the colonies have learned to make all of these things except for tea, because the tea leaves simply don't grow in the right environment in America. And a lot of those were coming out of China, through India, the British East India Company. And so England's got a full lock on this one. So what happened, right? Boycotting goes up, smuggling goes up, all the typical reactions, right? Now, out of this also, they passed what's referred to as the writs of assistance. Now, this is a very fancy word, guys, for search warrant. And so essentially, trade officials were allowed in all the major port cities, but primarily we're talking about Boston here, right? This is at the heart of where this kind of revolutionary action is happening. So they were allowed to enter homes and boats of any trade merchant that's trading stuff out of the American colonies. Well, they can literally walk in anywhere. And again, this is something that you're not allowed to have an illegal, search and seizure. You have to have a warrant. So they didn't provide proper paperwork. They were just literally going onto boats, into homes of known trade merchants. They're seizing goods. They're taking stuff out of the home. They're taking stuff off of boats. And again, it's illegal back in England. Why is it legal here, right? So all of this was repealed, glass, lead, paint, because they realized, well, we're not going to collect anything there. So the only one they left in there was tea, because they knew how much American colonists were addicted to tea. It's caffeinated, it tastes good, it becomes part of the part of the culture, and so they knew that people would buy it, right? We finally see blood being spilled in what's referred to as the Boston Massacre. Now, Boston, like I said, is at an epicenter of trade, shipping. Not to mention, remember, the New England areas, they're close, densely populated cities, right? So rumors and information travels fast. And so essentially, this is also where the highest concentration of redcoats are located as well. How the story goes is that there was a redcoat that had come in for actually a haircut, believe it or not. Was done by a Boston barber, and the redcoat basically walked out without paying and copped attitude with the barber on his way out. The next day, that redcoat and a few other redcoats were walking down the same alleyway. Barber sees them, starts screaming at these men to pay for pay the bill. And these are narrow Boston streets, so noise is echoing, and so people are hearing, is this a fight? What's happening? What's going on? So at first was about 5 redcoats and 1 barber, turned into all of a sudden 5 redcoats, 15 people, 20 people, 30 people. So they got afraid for their lives, even though the Bostonians aren't armed. They felt quite in danger, so they decided to basically head out and travel down to the end of the street where they knew the rest of their regiment was located, about 15 to 20 redcoats down there. So what happens is this crowd of 60 versus essentially 10 redcoats, 5 have been dispatched to go get reserves, all that kind of stuff. And basically it's so loud, the redcoats are on the defensive, they're up against the wall. The sun has gone down, it's cold, it's snowy, it's icy. Then all of a sudden, the colonists are chucking snowballs and chunks of ice at the redcoats. One hits a redcoat in the side of the head, boom, drops him right to the ground. Now, and there's blood coming out of the side of his head. Everyone assumed that a shot was fired, okay, amongst the redcoats. And the redcoats also thought they heard their commander yell fire, which he didn't, but there was so much noise happening. So the redcoats open up fire on these 60 unarmed Bostonians. The only ones that had technically weapons would have been the dock workers like Crispus Attucks, African-American gentleman who was the first one killed. And they had little billy clubs to, kill fish with, because they were on fishing boats, but no guns or anything. So they open up, 11 are injured, 5 are killed. Everybody disperses. And the redcoats are brought up on charges of, obviously killing innocent people. So they're going to be tried in what's called an admiralty court, which essentially is just a court extension from the king, right? So you can imagine how this is going to go. They're up, given their case of what happened, and the case goes in favor of the redcoats because the decision was made that they shot these people in defense. They felt their lives were threatened, even though they were unarmed, etc. You can see how this is going to go over amongst the colonists, and then this is going to spread throughout all the rest of the colonies here, the New England colonies primarily, even some of the middle colonies, Pennsylvania, things like that. So what happens is we see this famed character from history, Paul Revere, which we most know as the British are coming, right? His trail to warn Lexington and Concord that the British redcoats were coming, about 700 of them, as they were coming out to arrest John Hancock and Sam Adams, and seize weapons and things like that. But the Paul Revere here was a tinsmith, so he was a really good artist. He would tin it in, tin that you could, was malleable by a punch and a hammer. So he gets wind of this. He was not there, mind you, but he gets wind of this and paints a very famous piece of propaganda known as the Bloody Massacre. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. So if you look at the bar graph here on your slides, you'll notice that This is what, by the way, these are all the taxes, not all of them, but the biggest ones in the beginning. So revenue is what they thought they would make in profit, and then essentially what they thought they would have to pay to manage the taxes, right? Take a look at this. This is what they were bringing in, but this is what they were having to expend to manage the collection of that. Townshend duties. This is what they thought they would make. This is what they did make, right? And so this is what they thought they were going to make out of the Sugar Act. This is what they actually made. This is what they thought they were going to make out of the Stamp Act. This is what they made. So it's not so much about the colonists rebelling, burning things in effigy, writing letters of petition. It was more about just England was not making enough money out of this. So we see Sam Adams forming the famous Sons of Liberty. This is at the spot in Boston where the Boston Massacre actually occurred. And if you take a look at, this is Paul Revere's piece here, and this is Crispus Attucks, the first gentleman shot out of the 5 in this this attack. So you'll see he titles it The Bloody Massacre, Paul Revere does. And if you notice, there's just bloodshed, people being carried away. You don't see any billy clubs or anything else. And all you see is gun pointed at the innocent folks, opening up fire, commander with the sword up, which is kind of like the fire sign. Now, Paul Revere was not here, so did he embellish this? Yes. Did he do it for a major reason, as in to try to do an anti-British, anti-redcoat propaganda campaign? Absolutely. Much like today, if you see someone that might have posted this in a relation to correlating to something today, you'll notice that a lot of people don't dig deep in to see what the real story is. They just take it as fact because they see a headline or an Instagram post or a Snapchat post, right? And then this is probably more likely what was happening. You'll see the billy clubs from the dock workers, Crispus Attucks being shot and killed. So 2 different kind of accounts of what happened. Watch this video clip in class here, the Boston Massacre. You'll have to go back to the real Google slides there for you guys to take a look at that. So how is Britain going to fight back here? We then see another kind of a revolutionary sort of attack here going on on Boston itself. We see the tea tax, and so the Sons of Liberty and Sam Adams decided to make an attack on the tea and dump those 342 chests in the tea as they were dressed up like Mohawk Indians to disguise themselves. They're boarding 3 different boats. I mean, it's a lot of tea. Okay, they do it under the cover of darkness. All the Bostonians are cheering them on. This whole thing. So if they were so in love with tea, why didn't they just steal the tea? A lot of people have asked this before. And the major reason is because it's a major sign of rebellion, right? To actually take money out of their pockets, per se. This is lost profit that's just floating out to the Atlantic Ocean, right? And, it's coming in at about $1 million worth of today's money. So Britain is not going to handle this well. The king and the parliament are not going to handle this well. So they decide to literally lay the attack and blame on Boston. So they have 2 things. You either tell us who did this, and then we'll open back up your ports. Okay, so literally toss over who was responsible for this, or pay us back the money. Well, obviously they know they can't pay back the money, and nobody's coughing up Sam Adams or the Sons of Liberty. So England decides to shut Boston down completely. Okay, which means loss of profits, no boats in, no boats out. I mean, literally. I mean, it's kind of like, when we had places closing down here with COVID over the last couple of years, and some had to go out of business. They couldn't operate in the beginning. Same thing. No money in, no money out. Okay, and that's going to be a big hit on Boston. What they also did is they put restrictions on the town hall meetings, which, as you know, is a big Democratic foundation up there in New England. And so what this is going to lead to, which, depending on who you're talking to, England called them coercive acts because they were trying to coerce the colonists to cough over who was responsible, or at least pay back the money that was now a loss floating out into the Atlantic Ocean. If you talk to a colonist back then, now they're going to call them the intolerable acts because they're not tolerable. These are unfair. You're denying us the rights that we're entitled to. So what this would lead to is another Congress here. So we've had the Albany Congress, we've had the Stamp Act Congress, and remember, it was only 7 for the Albany Congress. It went to 9 for the Declaration of Rights and Grievances Stamp Act Congress. Okay. Now we're at the Continental Congress, which means an invitation was sent out to all of the 13 colonies. So this is going to happen between September and October 1774. 12 colonies show up, 56 delegates. This is the most that has shown up yet. No Georgia, though. I guess you can probably imagine why not. Georgia's that buffer colony. It's as far south as you're going to go. They don't feel like they can relate to any of this, so they're not going to send delegates. So the delegates that show up that are chosen from the 12 colonies, all 56 of them, show up in Philadelphia for 7 weeks, and they start to discuss, what do we need to do? They know that they're not prepared for war. They know that they're not prepared to go to war against England. They don't have an organized army, an organized navy. They don't have enough money to fund that. So what they're going to continue to do is appeal to the king and try to get more of this stuff repealed and just continue to write those letters back and forth. Okay. What they also agreed to was to continue to boycott British goods. This was known as the Association. So anybody that has joined, you agree to not buy British-made goods. So we'll continue to hit them in their wallets that way. Okay. They also agreed that if things don't get better, that they will meet again in May. So it's October. We'll meet again in May if need be. And obviously they would need be. That's a little bit of foreshadowing for you. So we're talking about 90,000 pounds of tea dumped in. Now, back then, this was worth 10,000 pounds worth, not pound weight, but pound monetary British note. That was about worth $1 million today. Okay. So this was a huge financial hit. This is also a good clip for you guys to watch today, which also kind of shows you what happened on the Boston Tea Party there. So at the First Continental Congress, we've got key players like Sam Adams, John Adams, George Washington, Patrick Henry. The thing about it is, though, this is so early in its Continental Congress, they only gave 1 vote per colony, right? So 12 colonies showed up, you got 12 votes, not a vote for every delegate, but just 12 votes total. So you can see by this great artist depiction, this is not, look at the hand and face, the stress, the anxiety, what is going to happen. They're praying. All of this is happening, and the uncertainty is huge, right? Okay, so we got to the end there. I made it without my voice cutting up too much. But so this is a big question for you guys. Should the French and Indian War be considered one of the major causes and leading factors to the American Revolution? Why or why not? Number 2, of all the acts, the taxes, right? We've discussed in this lecture, which one do you believe to be the most significant in deepening the divide between the colonists and England? Make sure you defend your choice, right? So again, treat these like, short answers, right? So this is, a good solid paragraph, Don't forget about that, guys. Okay. All right. So I'm going to end now, and hopefully we've got the Screencastify going here, and I'm going to stop.